8, 7, 6.
On this week's Texas Tribune TribCast, we'll talk about Beto O'Rourke's visit with Oprah, the latest on the lawsuits filed over Texas's voter citizenship review, and the news out of the state and the State of the Union. But before we do, I'd like to thank today's TribCast sponsors. Harmony Public Schools, Texas's largest STEM-focused free charter school system, is accepting applications now at campuses statewide. Visit harmonytx.org to see why the TEA awarded Harmony 6A ratings for 2018. And Texas State Technical College. Texas State Technical College is the solution to the skills gap in Texas. Find out more at tstc.edu. Hello, this is Emily Ramshaw here on Wednesday, February 6th with the Texas Tribune TribCast, our weekly Texas politics and policy podcast. I'm joined this week by engagement reporter Cassie Pollock.
Hello.
Hi, Cassie. My Democrat, that was a quiet, very genteel hello.
I didn't want to have a booming hello, but hello.
We'll save that for Patrick. Demographics reporter Alexa Ura.
Hello.
Hello. And political reporter Patrick Svitek.
Good afternoon.
Just back from his trip to visit with Oprah Winfrey and Beto O'Rourke.
And Bradley Cooper.
And Bradley Cooper. Oh, my God. The most important.
It's just the four of us. It's a special meeting.
As always, folks, we take your questions in real time on Twitter and Facebook. You can do it using the hashtag TribCast. Okay, Patrick, I promised Alexa I would do this. Did you win a car?
I did not. There's nothing under the seat.
Okay, since...
Let alone a car.
You are probably... The real unfairness in all of this is that there are probably 69 people on our staff who would have loved, dreamed of going on Oprah, and the 70th person on staff actually got to go on Oprah, and that is you.
I don't think you guys know about my secret Oprah fandom. I think I was
just
writing privately
your blog
elated yesterday.
Dedicated to Oprah.
So, okay, tell us all about it. Tell us, so you got there, and were you in a studio audience, or how did it work?
No, it was in a theater. It was a taping of a interview series special that she was doing for her TV network OWN. And it was hosted, it was taped inside the PlayStation Theater in Times Square. Pretty medium-sized theater, not, where they have concerts and other kind of TV tapings. But yeah, O'Rourke was the fourth of 5 interviews that she was taping there that day. The other people that are being interviewed were Michael B. Jordan, Lisa Borders, Bradley Cooper, as you mentioned.
Alexa actually mentioned that. That wasn't me.
Gates.
How close were you sitting to Bradley Cooper?
I was way in the back. Anyways, but this was, kind of... O'Rourke wasn't the main attraction, and in fact, based on kind of the crowd reaction, there definitely were people there who knew who he was, but I got the feeling that some of those other names may have been a bigger draw. Another reminder that the world doesn't revolve around Texas politics and our perception of it.
Maybe Bradley Cooper should run for president.
Yeah, exactly.
Don't tell Evan.
But the O'Rourke interview ended up being the longest of the interviews that she had, and she seemed very aware of how much hype and anticipation there was surrounding it. She made reference a lot of times to how many people are talking about this interview. This is so highly anticipated. Everyone's talking about it. Thousands of people waiting outside.
Right.
But she seemed very well aware of kind of the just the anticipation, and she asked him about 2020 a lot. There was some the first 10 minutes were some reflections on the Senate campaign, but after that she wasted a little time starting to ask him about was it yes or no, what are the big factors, what's your timeline, and that's that in response to that last question there is where the news came, which she was peppering him with these questions and said, well, have you at least given yourself a deadline? And he said, the answer is really soon, before the end of this month. And that was news because he just has not not put up any kind of timetable like that before.
So by the end of the month, within 3 weeks, basically, we're going to know whether or not.
Yeah, someone pointed out he chose the shortest month.
I know, only 28 days in February.
Are those deadlines?
You want to drag this out? February is a bad month.
Right.
Are those self-imposed deadlines, do they ever result in the person saying, I'm not running for president?
Never.
I think at this point, all of them have said, I'm running.
Yes, well, my perception whether he's going to run has definitely shifted, but I will point out
shifted since 2 weeks ago. I would like to just say, for the record, 2 weeks ago, Patrick scolded me on the podcast for jumping the gun on Beto O'Rourke.
He was pretty adamant that it wasn't happening.
Okay, well,
I think Alexa was here.
I'm changing my position, but I just want to put something out. There was a recent example of this where someone gave themselves a deadline in Texas politics and they decided not to run, and that was Joaquin Castro when he was deciding whether to join Beto O'Rourke in the U.S. Senate race. he gave himself a deadline of the end of, I think it was some month in the spring of 2017, and he decided against it. So it does happen.
All right,
Has happened
You
one
reached
time.
back into 2017.
All the way
there.
back to 2017.
So when she asked him about his sort of thoughts about running for president, he had a couple of quotes that I thought were like pretty telling that made me think he was going to run.
Yeah, the one other quote that stood out to me was he said he was, quote, excited about the prospect of being able to play that role, which that role referring to a presidential candidate. And so it seemed like something that he has come around to in terms of envisioning himself running for president.
He also said it was going to be basically the thing that would make him decide not to. My sense was his family.
Yeah,
He said,
absolutely.
This decision is, like, really up to my
he made
family.
clear that the family is still the biggest factor for him, and that matches up with what we've reported and others have reported throughout this process, that he continues to think about how this would impact his wife and 3 kids, especially after a Senate race where he was on the road nonstop for close to 2 years or a year and a half.
But which wife and kids ever say, "Dad, don't run for president"? You're like once in a lifetime shot. I don't.
Sure.
To me, if that's if that is what he said could be the deciding factor in not running, he's totally running.
Well, and didn't he at one point say that one of his sons was even like ready to get him out of the house?
Yeah, he joked, one of his sons,
yeah.
Ulysses, is, like already sick of having him home, basically, and ready to have him out of the house. But yeah, he didn't seem to offer any kind of reservations that, he internally had. You know what I'm saying? It was more about external factors like his family. It seems like personally he's, at peace with running for president. I mean, he didn't talk about,
He's
these
out
are
of the funk?
reservations. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I mean, I think it was, it was definitely interesting to see him open up in that way, because when he's talked about the potential run before, he has sounded, as we pointed out recently on this podcast,
As
sounded
we
much
have
more
pointed out.
much more ambivalent. It was a consensus, I'm pretty sure.
I mean, so this whole like drive to clear his head was not actually to clear his head, is what I think came through from
No,
this
I
interview.
am going back to my Hillary Clinton listening tour.
Right.
Yeah. So what did he talk about beyond the presidency? I mean,
Well,
he said it was one of the
he
longest
reflected on the
interviews.
Senate campaign. He talked about kind of the trajectory after the race and feeling a lot of disappointment, and then going on that road trip that we just mentioned, and that kind of pulling him out of this funk, at least in his telling. She asked him about a few issues at the end, and then this isn't getting a lot of play, but I thought it was interesting. She actually asked him some pretty pointed questions on providing some details on immigration policy. And there was
right.
one
He's been sort of called out.
Right.
I think the Washington Post or the New York Times.
Exactly,
ran a
which
piece.
kind of called to mind that Washington Post interview
Yeah.
where he basically said, "I don't know," in response to a number of specific questions on immigration, and he continued to keep things pretty general in response to that question with Oprah. He just said, we need to have immigration policy that reflects our value, American values and needs and principles, and talked about what he said before about he wants to make every dreamer a U.S. citizen today, but in terms of offering any new detail or trying to satisfy the people who may have been worried about his responses in that Washington Post interview, I don't think he did much. Didn't get a lot of attention, obviously, because all the news was about 2020, but she did ask him some interesting questions at the end that were pretty pointed about that.
Did she make any suggestions about whether Oprah herself would ever run for president? Did he flip the question around on her?
He flipped the question on her at one point, but she wasn't having it. She was like, she just completely steered the conversation back to him. So
Interesting. So, who was in the audience? I mean, if it was not the same audience as the audience for like Bradley Cooper or anything, right?
Yeah, it was mainly the same audience throughout it. People came and went. But, there were definitely some people who were clearly there to see him exclusively. They were wearing, Beto O'Rourke shirts, and, they were cheering very loudly when he was, being interviewed and whatnot. And so I think he was a big draw. But like I said earlier, I mean, we forget it's not the center of the universe. There were people there clearly to see, more interested in Bradley Cooper or maybe Michael B. Jordan, the other actor.
Well, if I had to choose between going to see Beto O'Rourke and Bradley Cooper, I would absolutely choose Bradley Cooper. No contest.
If other people who work with us were sitting here, they probably would have answered it the other way around.
Yes, well, I'm not every other person. All right, well, let's switch gears. Alexa, you have a lot of fans on our social media feed right now. They're writing, "Alexa Ura, my queen," and our heroine, Alexa Ura. So apparently you have a big and growing fan base. So thanks for being here. You're a Bradley Cooper level draught.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I mean, better than Beto.
Indeed. All right, so I want to wade into the latest on the state's review of the citizenship of some 95,000 people on the Texas voter roll. They were trying to determine basically whether these folks have either registered or voted illegally. We know now from your reporting that this has fallen apart. To what degree? Exactly how far has this fallen apart?
I mean, I think at this point, tens of thousands of names off of the original list the state put out have fallen off this list, either because the Secretary of State's office mistakenly included them, or because local officials have been able to confirm that there are people who registered at like naturalization ceremonies and therefore are within their rights to register to vote and vote in Texas elections. I think that obviously we have 3 lawsuits at this point against this, but I think that the most interesting part is that this entire exercise, which was meant to, list maintenance or to verify people on the rolls, has instead resulted in local election officials basically holding off for the most part on doing anything because 1, they're worried about being sued, and 2, they're worried about whether this process will end up jeopardizing naturalized citizens who are on the list, because if you get this notice of examination saying you have to prove your citizenship, if you don't respond within 30 days, you get knocked off the rolls. But it's also if you haven't updated your address and they get back an undeliverable notice from the Postal Service about that, you're knocked off too. And so I think local officials are treading very, very carefully. And if this was a whole effort to, clean up the voter rolls, most people are not doing anything at this point.
So most of the counties, just to confirm, so the counties that you're talking to, is it fair to say that most counties are basically saying to the state, you've asked us to do this review and we're just not doing it?
Yeah, so we've talked mostly to folks in the top 30 counties with the most registered voters who have a bulk of the names on this list, who have said, yes, you gave us this guidance. This guidance also says that we're not required to do this.
Oh, it never required them to.
Right, yeah. It said that they could look into this further or not do anything. Obviously, in some of these counties that are controlled by Republicans, I've heard from folks who are saying, there is some pressure to review these lists. Like, we can't just ignore them completely. But I think for the most part, people are now saying, we're going to hold off on this. And some of those messages, as I've been told, have gotten back to the Secretary of State's office.
So, even with tens of thousands of names knocked off of this original list of 95,000, that's not obviously the whole list. At the end of the day, would there have been evidence that some people voted illegally?
I mean, I think that's what we have asked for updates. Originally, the Secretary of State's office had said 58,000 of the people on the original list had some form of voting history. It's unclear how many of those folks were mistakenly included as part of that first batch that have been removed from the rolls. We have not gotten any answers whatsoever. The other question is whether, if people were cleared from this, whether that information will be sent to the Attorney General's office, who already has this list as well and can prosecute people. So there are a lot of questions. David Whitley, the Secretary of State, is up for a confirmation hearing on Thursday, so I think it's possible we might get some of those answers tomorrow.
Let's talk about that in particular. Some questions coming in on social media. Do you think David Whitley's nomination as Secretary of State is imperiled by the, quote, election fraud debacle? Carrie asks. And just give us a little backstory on him before we talk about the fact that he is up for nomination.
Yeah, so Whitley is a longtime aide of Governor Greg Abbott. He worked with him when he was in the Texas Attorney General's office. He followed him to the governor's office. He oversaw appointments, actually, ironically, for him for quite some time before he was elevated to Deputy Chief of Staff. That's the last position he held before he was tapped to be Secretary of State. At this point, but because he was appointed during the interim before the session was, before lawmakers were in session, he sort of floated by as an interim appointment, and now he's up for confirmation by the Senate. So it'll start with the nominations committee, which is meeting on Thursday, and he's among, I think it's 5 others who are on the list of people that they'll consider that day. First, we have to see if his appointment gets out of committee, and then once it gets to the floor, he'll need a two-thirds vote of everyone who's present on the floor, which means that the Republicans, even if they all supported him, don't have enough votes to confirm him if everyone's on the floor the day of that vote.
So do you think it's likely or even feasible that he does not get confirmed in light of this? I mean, obviously the Democrats are very pissed about how this has all gone down.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Democrats have some power in this. I will say Senate Democrats have been much more measured in their response compared to House Democrats, who have been really loudly critical of all of these actions. So I think we'll have to, it'll definitely give Democrats some power in this vote. I think the other question, does this even get to the floor for a vote? Is this a sort of conversation where they say the votes aren't there, you have to pull him? Obviously, all of that is speculation at this point. And Senate Democrats have have a track record of aligning with Republicans on issues that House Democrats probably would never align with them.
Fair to say.
So,
to be clear, this is 2/3 of the Senate floor, on the Senate floor.
Correct.
Yeah, so 19 Republicans right now don't have enough.
Right.
You just want a Republican.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, has Abbott? Is there evidence that Whitley was not like a rogue operator? I'm imagining in all of this, it seems like the missive or the message to do this must have come down from on high. I mean, do we have a sense has Abbott's office weighed in on this more recently than last week, where they sort of brushed it off?
Yeah, I have not gotten any indication of what the governor may or may not be feeling at this point beyond what we heard from him last week, where he basically, looked to recast this. When this was first announced, he said, thank you for discovering this illegal vote registration. He promised a legislative fix. Now he's saying, this is a work in progress. So it's unclear sort of if he is holding firm in his support of this beyond what he has said publicly, which indicates yes. I think the Secretary of State's office obviously is a government appointed person. In the past, they have somewhat closely aligned with the governor's views. I think the one difference there was Carlos Gascos, who was two Secretary of States ago, who basically said, he could not really toe the party line when it came to these claims of rampant voter fraud that have never been really supported with data.
And he'd been appointed by Rick Perry.
He was appointed by Greg Abbott, actually.
Oh, Abbott, really?
Yeah, he was Abbott's first Secretary of State.
And he wouldn't toe that party line.
Right.
Interesting.
And so, he hasn't indicated that that's why he left the office after 2 years, which is sort of the typical timeline for a Secretary of State. But I think it's safe to say that typically the person in that position is, probably pretty in line with the governor, at least on big issues. They've all been Republicans.
Given Whitley's background with Abbott, it seems like highly likely that, he was perfectly aligned.
Sure.
So, we'll talk about the lawsuits that have been filed around this. I know there are multiple, and I'm curious if there have been any immediate injunctions or anything like that.
Yeah, so we actually have the first hearing coming up on January 19th in the first lawsuit, which was filed on behalf of LULAC. Atascosa County resident has since joined that lawsuit because she confirmed that she was on this list of voters. And so she has joined that. She's trying to represent all of the legitimate voters on the list as a plaintiff class. I don't think the judge has ruled on that motion yet. So that's the first one that we'll be sort of considering. It's a preliminary injunction request, so we'll see if the state will be blocked from doing any of this. More importantly, if their advisory to counties to check this list will be rescinded or not. That I think is sort of the big question at this point. But there are two other lawsuits. Basically, all of them allege this is a constitutional violation. This violates the Voting Rights Act. This affects people of color. It treats naturalized citizens differently than those who were born here in the country. So there are still a lot of questions about this. A lot of this litigation will probably go on for months. But I think the first thing will be whether there's a preliminary injunction on this.
Well, it'll be interesting to watch with Whitley this week. Thank you for your reporting on this, Alexa. Before our next topic, I'd like to quickly thank two more TribCast sponsors, Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Texas. It's time for a moonshot to fix rural healthcare in Texas. Read more on tribtalk.org, and South by Southwest EDU. Join us at South by Southwest EDU 2019 for hundreds of innovative sessions and opportunities to connect with education visionaries. Visit southbysouthwest.edu for more. All right, Cassie, let's talk about Abbott's State of the State. What he did say, and maybe more importantly, what he didn't say.
Right.
Fill us in.
Well, I guess to Alexa's point, I think a lot of people thought that Abbott had an opportunity yesterday during his State of the State address to maybe just kind of mention, or at least kind of update us on where he's at with the whole voter registration, voter citizenship check. He did not mention that. And then also notably absent from his speech was some of the more red meat social issues that were definitely present and headlined his speech in 2017 when the legislature last met. But he did lay out his 6 emergency items that he wants Texas lawmakers to pass. And
Let's see if you guys can remember them.
I give up.
I have a list that I'm going to be.
It was going to be like a quiz game.
I
So.
could
Go, Patrick.
okay,
All right,
go ahead.
let's hear it.
actually, I don't know. No.
Try. Now you have to try.
School finance.
One.
I wasn't even here. School finance, teacher
whoa,
pay.
okay. Wow.
This is the guy who was sitting with Oprah.
That's your turn.
All right.
School finance.
Yes.
Do it in order that he mentioned.
Okay. I can maybe do that, actually.
All right,
Go
number
ahead.
1.
Okay.
Go.
school finance,
Number 2.
teacher pay,
What specifically with teacher pay?
teacher pay raise.
Okay.
Increasing teacher pay. Wow.
Great.
Tough crowd.
She's calling you. 3.
3 would be school safety.
Mm-hmm.
4.
Then mental health, although those 2 were kind of interlinked in his speech.
Okay. 5.
Then we had disaster response. I don't know if that's the right order.
Cassie's
okay, we
shaking
had
her
property
head.
taxes then.
5 is property taxes. And what specifically about property taxes to play Cassie's game?
Rollback rates?
Property tax. I guess he's
Oh,
calling
reform?
it reform,
Oh,
right?
Yes.
Oh, my God.
Yes. All right.
And then
6.
6 is disaster response, right?
All right. Good job, Patrick.
I could tell you the other issues mentioned in the speech, too. You want me to give you?
No, thanks.
Let's
Back
move
to
on.
Cassie. Yeah, right.
It's fine. So those are basically the issues that lawmakers can start immediately working on. In fact, a Senate committee hearing, as I believe, as we're talking, meeting right now to consider Senate Bill 2, which is the property tax proposal that's kind of been championed and endorsed by Abbott, along with Dan Patrick and Dennis Bonnen. Beyond that, I guess on school finance reform and teacher pay, Abbott seemed to kind of nod toward the merit pay based system, which is something that I think Dallas ISD has adopted and is currently experimenting with right now. And then beyond that, he on school safety, he did not make any mention of any sort of like gun control measures. Rather so, just trying to nod towards mental health care and mental health reforms. And then beyond the emergency items, which I think Patrick said that he could tick off, we had Abbott wants 2 new anti-gang centers, one in Waco and one in Tyler. He wants additional funding to curb human trafficking, additional funding to eliminate the backlog of thousands of untested rape kits. So a pretty straightforward speech from Abbott. I don't think that there was anything particularly new. It was
Wait. What did we learn about UT and Texas A&M and football?
So he basically is down to revive the annual football game, and he's even, he said during his speech today, willing to work with Lyle Larson, a San Antonio Republican who he's clashed with in the past, to make that happen.
A line that received a louder applause line than
like
fighting
fixing
human
mental health
trafficking.
or fighting human trafficking.
Yeah, I mean, people were excited about it,
For the
much more so
record,
than fighting human
It
trafficking.
also got its own headline on our website.
Yeah.
So there is a lot of enthusiasm.
Just
by Matthew Watkins.
Yes, yes.
carry on.
Let's call out our breaking news editor, Matthew Watkins, who made that important, critical call for our coverage.
Right.
It was
Yep.
just, I think it was Abbott, more or less trying to carry on this sense of camaraderie, the kumbaya moment that has seemed to kind of define this legislature so far.
Yeah, I mean, I was at a Texas Lyceum event last week where Dan Patrick spoke, and the whole theme of his, remarks was, look at how well we're doing with this sort of kumbaya moment. Look how well we're all getting along. Look, have you ever seen the big 3, playing this well together in recent history? And so it's from the governor's office all the way on down, it seems like that's the message, and they're trying to avoid anything that might get in the way of
It's
that.
like the most you've seen anyone talk about Joe Strauss without mentioning his name. I mean,
Yes,
it's just
right.
been remarkable how many nods there have been to that basically since November 7th.
Yeah. That said, I did, of course, try to chase Dan Patrick down afterward to ask him about the voter fraud stuff, and I was told he would not be answering any questions. So. All right. Well, thank you, Cassie. We talked about the state of the state. In our last few minutes here, let's talk about the State of the Union. It seemed like in this seemingly endless address, the first half of it seemed like Trump was really trying to sort of play to both sides of the aisle. And then the gloves came off, it seemed like around the wall and immigration issues in particular. What did he say?
Yeah, I mean, I thought there was a dissonance, I think, between some of these sections where, as you pointed out, he was calling for bipartisanship and talking about some issues that have some legitimate bipartisan unity around them. And then you saw him in other parts of the speech go into territory that is clearly politically divisive and inflammatory. I mean, you mentioned immigration and border security and his push for a border wall. He didn't, back down from that at all and continued to use the incendiary kind of an inflammatory rhetoric surrounding, this exaggerated idea of a crisis on the border.
Mm-hmm. He really
So I
honed
thought
in
there
on
was-
El Paso. I mean, that,
Right, he loves El Paso.
Yeah.
And now he's
Talk about his messaging a little bit. You were talking about that inflammatory language. Talk about how
right.
it
Well,
reflects-
he and his administration have held up El Paso as an example of a place where, after a wall was built or a border barrier was built, that crime plummeted and it became this, safe utopia. And, the El Paso Times and a lot of local media outlets have done a good job of basically debunking that claim that the wall, did not, that
Crime rates
crime
had
was
been,
already falling, or that, basically
rates had
that,
been dropping for years and years ahead of the wall, the portion of the wall that's there being constructed.
So, and he brought that up again in the State of the Union speech, and announced this morning that he's going to be having a campaign rally in El Paso on Monday, which we can expect him to continue to repeat that falsehood about the crime rate in El Paso surrounding the wall.
What is turnout at a rally for Donald Trump going to look like in El Paso, Texas?
I mean, New Mexico is pretty close by.
So they can just hop on over.
Yeah.
Border crossers.
I mean, I do think it was, we've talked a lot about how the fact that the State of the State and the State of the Union were happening at the same time, mostly creating a busy news day.
And Oprah.
But I do think it's interesting that for all the talk from sort of Trump land about this emergency at the border, it was just a couple of lines in Abbott's speech on when he talked to lawmakers before, after they had sort of sent the Texas National Guard down to the border. They had increased the funding for DPS down there. It sort of barely made a blip this go around. And it was interesting to see sort of the contrast in the rhetoric nationally versus what even Abbott was saying.
And in fact, I think, go ahead.
I was going to say, just even more broadly than Abbott's speech, the opening of this session has been marked by very little discussion of immigration policy. Now, we've seen immigration rhetoric. Dan Patrick goes on Fox News and is defending what the president's doing at the federal level. But in terms of legislation or state level policy, obviously there's a limited role there for that, but to the point that there could be something done at the state level further, there's been so little discussion. It's been a jarring contrast with the national level.
And to Alexa's point, I mean, I think Abbott had a line in his speech somewhat yesterday to the effect of, hey, the federal government hasn't carried through on its promise to help fund, our border. That's why I'm asking for, for you guys to basically fully fund, that program again. And I think it's $800 million. And, obviously House Democrats are quick to say that's completely unnecessary. Why are we doing this? We have, more guards at the border, crime rates, the whole 9 yards. So anyway.
What do you think would get better turnout? Trump's rally in El Paso or a potential Beto O'Rourke presidential announcement in El Paso?
I think the latter. I think it's an interesting political move to the extent that it's a campaign rally. There's clearly political strategy going into the location that this is coming. I'm sure it was maybe planned before Beto O'Rourke's Oprah interview, but it's coming when O'Rourke is clearly in the final stages of deciding on a run. And there's no doubt that this rally is going to elevate and grow O'Rourke's political profile even more. I mean, I'd be shocked if Trump doesn't mention him or something like that. He's already mentioned him at the Cruz rally that he did in Houston during the re-election campaign. And so it'll be interesting to see. I mean, this rally is definitely going to make O'Rourke a bigger figure. It'll be interesting to see how much and which way. And
make El Paso figure even more in the conversation around the, not just the border wall, but the next, the looming government shutdown over the next version of this. So one thing that I thought was particularly interesting about the State of the Union that we learned sort of toward the end or in the aftermath was that former Texas Governor Rick Perry was the designated survivor, the fastest route to the presidency, the guy in the room who wasn't in the room in case the whole thing blew up. At what point did you learn that information? Was there any heads up about that earlier?
I think it was just reported or released by the White House, usually in the few minutes before. Yeah.
Way to go, Rick Perry.
Every now and then there's always some Rick Perry at the federal level story that kind of bubbles up, and it's usually something just like this.
Find a way to bring it all back to Rick Perry. So, all right, well, that's all the time we have this week. Thanks to Harmony Public Schools, the Texas State Technical College, Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Texas, and South by Southwest EDU, our sponsors this week. And an extra special thanks to Spoon for our theme music. On behalf of Cassie, Alexa, Patrick, and our producers, Michael, Ray, and Bobby, this is Emily. Thanks for listening.